Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our How to Continuously Monitor Vendors webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 of the polling questions that appear on your screen during today's presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We will be sending the link to that follow-up survey 24 hours after this live session. If you meet all requirements, we will send you your CPE certificate within 5 to 7 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Kelly Vick, VendMinder's president. She will discuss how continuously monitoring your vendors is crucial to help your organization identify issues and mitigate those before they become too big to handle. She will also walk through how continuous monitoring improves and benefits your organization. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, and our VendMonitor product tour, links to our vendor due diligence checklist, the differences between vendor assessments, questionnaires, due diligence, and continuous monitoring infographic, our types of third-party vendor risk ebook, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Kelly. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jessie, for that introduction. Well, hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you today, and we can't thank you enough for joining us for this webinar and all of the webinars that you decide to join this year. We're passionate about what we do, and we love sharing these very important topics and best practices with all of you. So let's take a look at our agenda for today's session about ongoing or continuous monitoring. As you can see, we will first talk about where continuous monitoring fits into your third-party risk management lifecycle or program. Then we will talk about how it protects your organization, basically why you should be doing this. Then we'll talk through how to align your monitoring with the appropriate risk level and talk through how to use risk intelligence data to help you in that process. And we'll spend some time talking through the specific vendor risk domains with some examples. And of course, we'll always end with a few key takeaways. So let's just jump right into it. Okay, so let's start by taking a quick look at the third-party risk management lifecycle. By the way, I might shorten third-party risk management to TPRM throughout this presentation, and I might shorten this to just lifecycle. So just wanted to state that up front in case I do. Anyway, back to the lifecycle. You will see that continuous monitoring or ongoing monitoring sits right in the middle of the lifecycle. The bulk of your vendors or suppliers will live in this stage because some of your vendors will be in onboarding. You haven't quite finalized everything with them yet, and some will live in offboarding because you're ending the relationship with them. But all other vendors, those that you have a contractual relationship with of some kind that you use in your daily practices, will live in the ongoing monitoring phase and are the vendors we are discussing today. Definitionally, continuous monitoring is the review or oversight of several attributes of your vendors or suppliers so that you can get a thorough picture of the overall risk they pose to your organization. It's not just a best practice either. It is a regulatory requirement for many of you. Whether you are a financial institution, a healthcare company, an energy company, or any company in some other industry, you are directly regulated and required to perform continuous monitoring of your vendors, or you have some indirect requirement to do so. So we'll dig into more of this as we go along. So before you can begin monitoring vendor risk, you'll need to identify the types and amounts of risk in the relationship. In other words, what kinds of risks does this vendor pose to your organization and how severe are those risks? The first step in identifying these should occur before you even select and onboard a vendor. Inherent risks naturally occur within a product or service. The actual definition of inherent is existing in something as a permanent, essential, or characteristic attribute. The results of an inherent risk assessment should include a rating, usually on a scale of low, moderate, or high, or some variation of that rating scale. Best practices recommend a rating scale no greater than 5. At the same time, you want to determine the vendor's criticality to you. In its simplest terms, how dependent are you on this vendor? Would the loss of this vendor have a significant impact on your company and the service that you're providing? Would you be able to continue within a relatively short window, 48 hours for example, without this vendor? Or could you easily replace this vendor within that 48-hour window or bring what they do in-house? If you are that dependent on the vendor that you can't move forward with the service you're providing without this vendor, then they are a critical vendor to your organization. And as a quick reminder, you should know both of these, an inherent risk rating and the criticality of a vendor before you begin working with that vendor. So once you have determined the inherent risk and the criticality, you can now use that information to determine the scope of your risk-based due diligence. How big will it be? How small will it be? For all vendors, regardless of inherent risk and criticality, you should collect and or review certain basic foundational vendor information, such as their legal name, validate their address, obtain their tax ID number, maybe review their insurance coverage. There could be several other items within that as well. But this is truly just making sure that vendor is legitimate and exists. Then for those vendors you've deemed critical and those with high inherent risk, you will require additional, more robust due diligence. Some items you should collect and review might include audited financial statements, a list of your vendor's critical subcontractors, third-party audit reports, and much more. So let's shift our focus for just a moment and talk about why this is important to your organization. How continuous monitoring protects you. For one, continuous monitoring keeps you informed of your vendor's risk as things can and do change. Being aware of any changes within your vendors that could be harmful to the relationship you have with them and the service that they're providing you allows you to be nimble and act quickly should you need to make a change with that vendor. Of course, the most common concern these days with using third-party vendors and continuously monitoring them is the risk of a data breach. But continuous monitoring goes beyond just monitoring for that. Let's spend a few minutes talking about how continuous monitoring protects your organization. One way that it can do that is to make you aware that new risks are emerging. A new vendor risk might emerge because of internal or external factors. Was the vendor acquired by another organization, for example? Or did the vendor open a new location, maybe in a different country? Are there new regulatory requirements that affect this vendor or the industry that this vendor is in? These types of situations can expose your organization to new vendor risks that you didn't identify earlier but now exist, and those should be addressed. And then existing risks can change. So consistency with the risks posed by your vendor is ideal, but that is certainly not guaranteed. Maybe you discovered some recent performance issues as you are faithfully tracking their SLA performance. Or maybe the vendor suffered a data breach that exposed some of your organization's data. It's also possible that one or some of the vendor's controls are no longer operating effectively. These risks were already known about your vendor since you performed an inherent risk assessment when you onboarded them, but some of them might have changed since then and pose an even greater risk. So let's talk through a few examples of this on the next few slides. So we're going to talk through 4 examples of how continuous monitoring can protect your organization. The first is with compliance. This is a fairly well-known scenario, as we've all seen the CFPB fines in this area. So here's an example. A credit card organization outsources its call center customer service to a third-party vendor. What's not known to you is employees at that call center have been engaging in misleading and deceptive practices that's pressuring consumers into buying add-on products. The regulators discovered these activities, and the credit card organization is issued an enforcement action for violating the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Although the call center was the one engaging in these violations, the credit card organization is at fault for non-compliance. Another way that it protects you is through your reputation risk. This is a fairly well-known one as well, and now more apparent thanks to ESG regulation, environmental, social, and governance laws. An online retailer uses different vendors to manufacture its clothing, but fails to monitor them on a continuous basis. Over time, one of the vendors begins facing accusations of poor working conditions, such as unfair wages and a lack of proper safety equipment. The retailer's reputation takes a significant downturn after customers learn about these accusations and voice their disapproval. Again, this reputation falls back to you because you are, in the customer's mind, the one representing this vendor that you're using. And then continuing on, the financial risk. This is another one that has been far more visible lately with the quantity of layoffs that we've seen in the last year. An organization has a vendor that provides customer relationship management, or CRM software. Without continuous monitoring, the organization doesn't realize that its vendor has been losing customers over several months, causing its revenue to plummet by 50%. This decrease in revenue leads to a staff reduction of 10%, which causes the vendor to begin missing its contractual SLAs. This situation is often referred to as a domino effect, where one event leads to another and can potentially lead to an overall collapse of an organization's operations. And the last one is operational risk, and I've actually seen this scenario happen, not in the medical space, but it can happen in any industry. A healthcare organization uses an outsourced data center to store electronic patient information, but hasn't been continuously monitoring certain activities. The data center is in an area that's prone to natural disasters, and it hasn't tested its business continuity plan in over 2 years. Since the healthcare organization failed to monitor this vendor, it didn't realize that its business continuity plan was flawed. After a serious weather-related event, the organization couldn't access its data for an extended period. So again, these are just 4 examples of how you can be protected by committing to and adhering to continuous monitoring. So this now brings us to our first poll question. Jesse, I'll turn it over to you.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, what does your organization use to determine the vendor's inherent risk? A best guess based on services and no real quantification, a points or tally system or other homegrown method, a methodology unique to a software application, other or not sure. Kelly, we have some time for a question from the audience. And this question is, I understand that gathering appropriate due diligence documentation from our vendors is a key step in monitoring them. But what if a vendor won't provide that information? What is my recourse?
Yeah, and that's a really good question because we are seeing more and more of that these days. So there's a few things to consider. One is, will they share them with you in person or maybe via a conference call so that you can at least review the documentation? If you can do that, then you can take notes of what you reviewed. Of course, they may restrict some of that as well. But hopefully that's an option. Another option is you could potentially go on site and do an on-site audit of the vendor and then review the documents there as well. And then also check and see if they're willing to share some documents possibly, but not all. We do find that some vendors will share a limitation or have a limitation with what they're willing to share, but they may not share things like financials or audit results, for example. If they aren't willing to accommodate your request in any way, then certainly document fully your attempts and their response. And then I would definitely rate the vendor's risk a little bit higher because of that, and be prepared to require this documentation in your next contract renewal.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Also, before we move on, in the Related Content widget, you'll find our Vendor Due Diligence Checklist available for download. As we briefly discussed due diligence as part of the initial vendor risk identification, this is a helpful checklist to grab. Kelly, let's continue with the presentation.
Before the poll question, we talked through some examples of how continuous monitoring would have helped you identify an issue so that you could mitigate the risks before they became bigger problems or bigger issues. In other words, how continuous monitoring protects your organization. So let's continue on that path and talk about the benefits of continuous monitoring. One benefit of using real-time data, assuming you have a monitoring solution in place, is you can gather real-time data across multiple vendors for comparison, or you can do quick snapshots of a single vendor for comparison to a previous review. Either way, this monitoring of real-time data will give you some quick insight into new or evolving risks. And then what you learn from that monitoring of this real-time data will tell you where you should be spending more time or focusing more focused or specific monitoring, including where you should be spending your time and resources. Another benefit of continuous monitoring is you always have a sense of the vendor's value to your organization. It can be very easy to onboard a vendor, set it up, and forget about it, and then years later wonder why you even needed that vendor solution. So again, this continuous monitoring of these vendors makes you ask yourself these questions. And then, of course, the biggest benefit of all is keeping you clear of costly surprises, such as regulatory violations, cyber breaches, and instability in your vendor's operations. That's just a few of the surprises you will hope to avoid with continuous monitoring. So let's now turn our focus on what to do with what you have learned, or actually how to use continuous monitoring. So if you've uncovered a concern or an issue, you should open a formal issue or case, or whatever you might call it in your organization. Regardless of how you do it or what you call it, every third-party risk management program should include an issue management strategy with details on how to identify, document, escalate, and resolve issues that you've uncovered. Then you want to report that issue to senior management or the board, and how far up you go that ladder depends on your organization's governance program, which should outline what types of issues are to be reported and to whom. And certain risk data or issues you uncovered might require a contract review to make sure that your vendor is meeting its obligations. Monitoring vendor risk and managing your contract should both be part of your continuous activities. An elevated risk that might exist from these issues that you uncovered in those, that ongoing monitoring will certainly help guide your due diligence activities. It will show you where to focus your efforts, whether that means more frequent reviews or whether it indicates you should gather and review additional documentation from that vendor. Up to this point, we've focused mostly on how continuous monitoring benefits you. Let's focus our attention now on what you should be continuously monitoring. Let's start with your vendor's performance. Monitoring your vendor's performance will validate that they are meeting their required SLAs, It also could alert you to some key risk indicators that should require further review or could point you to some possible areas of concern. News about your vendors is so readily available these days, so keeping an eye on negative news and consumer complaints has never been easier. But as we all know, not all public news is accurate, so be mindful of that. It is important, however, to know how your vendor is portrayed in the public eye. Consumer complaint filings or negative reports about your vendor can ultimately put your reputation at risk. And stay informed of your vendor's financial health by monitoring their public filings if they're a public company. If they aren't a public company, and most vendors are not, consider using a financial monitoring alert service. And a few more. Cybersecurity incidents are, of course, occurring at an alarming pace. The chances are good that one of your vendors has had or will have a cyber event. As part of your continuous monitoring, ensure that your vendor is adhering to their stated data breach notification procedures and that they have stated notification procedures. Continuous monitoring keeps you informed of any vendor issues or changes to their internal processes. Maybe their control environment had some changes. Maybe their staffing levels changed, as I mentioned a moment ago, and possibly maybe some changes to critical staffing, all of which could be impactful to you. And above all, a risk assessment should be part of your continuous monitoring efforts. How often you perform the risk assessment should be proportionate to the level of inherent risk. Remember, that's a risk that naturally occurs with the vendor or as part of the vendor product. And never adjust your monitoring frequency to match the residual risk or the risk that remains after you applied some mitigating controls. So determine that inherent risk level and base your monitoring, your level of due diligence, your level of review on the inherent risk. And you say, that's an awful lot to do. How in the world am I going to do that with the limited resources that I have? Because most of you are working with limited resources. So let's talk about a few ways to ensure success with this. Here's 4 tips we suggest you consider. 1 is automating as much as possible. We all know that humans make errors or just forget to do things, steps. So manual monitoring comes, of course, with increased risk of some failures along the way. So consider using risk monitoring and alert services to help keep a consistent eye on your vendor risk profile. And then we've talked about uncovering potential issues and changes to risks a few slides back, but it's not good enough to find them. You also need to make sure you actually have remediation plans identified to address those issues that you found. So be sure to have remediation plans in place. And as a reminder, you need to report any new or emerging issues that you discovered to senior management and or the board based on your governance, however high up that ladder you need to go. And unless everything is thoroughly documented, monitoring your vendors and remediating those issues that you uncovered will serve little value. And if you are anything like most people, you will forget about what you found and remediated before the next review. So write it down. Remember the quip: if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. Okay, so let's talk about that frequency again. We talked about it just a couple of moments ago, but I want to spend a few more minutes on it. So again, your risk-based assessments need to be comprehensive and fit the risk. You need to do that in proportion to your time and resources that you have available to you as well. So in other words, what I mean by that is don't establish a comprehensive monitoring program for low-risk vendors if you don't have the time and resources to do that, which most of you probably would not. And at the same time, in developing and determining what that comprehensiveness and frequency should be, it needs to be consistent with your TPRM governance. So you should be reviewing your policy program and procedures on a regular basis as well, and aligning them and adjusting them as needs arise. remembering at the same time that there are regulations that you will probably need to adhere to, so don't make adjustments that are no longer keeping you in compliance with that. A lot stated in that, but as a general rule and best practice, critical and high-risk vendors should be reviewed at least annually, some more than annually, but at least annually. Moderate risk vendors, you can go to every 18 months to 2 years, and low risk vendors every 2 or 3 years. So with that, that brings us to our next poll question. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, how often do you perform continuous monitoring on your vendors? Annually, periodically based on risk, periodically based on workload. Currently, we don't perform continuous monitoring, other, or not sure. Kelly, I have another question here that we can answer. And this question is, what is the best way to determine the schedule or frequency of ongoing review or monitoring for my vendors?
And that is a very easy answer. You should always use your inherent risk rating as the basis for all vendor risk management activities. Even though your vendor may have a lower residual score because you found ways to mitigate the risk, you should still be performing monitoring activities driven by that inherent risk rating. And now that you know it's based on the inherent risk rating, you should establish monitoring standards that make sense for your organization and your resources, and document those in your third-party risk management governance documents, policy and program, so that everyone involved in the process across the organization understands the expectations. As a general rule and best practice, critical and high-risk vendors should be reviewed at least annually, moderate risk vendors every 18 months to 2 years, and low-risk vendors every 2 to 3 years. So hopefully that gives you some guidance to go on.
Thanks, Kelly. We've got about 25 seconds left on this open poll question, so please get those answers in momentarily. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before we move on, I'd like to remind you that you'll find the differences between vendor assessments, questionnaires, due diligence, and continuous monitoring infographic within the related content widget and available for download. Back to you, Kelly.
As we've all quickly realized, or many already knew, ongoing monitoring is time-consuming. It requires resources and costs money. So finding ways to supplement what you have put into practice is a sound strategy. One such way is to use risk intelligence products. And there are other uses for this risk intelligence data as well. For example, it can highlight risks during pre-contract evaluations and vetting, that onboarding before you bring that vendor on. It can prioritize vendors for risk mitigation management. It can help you identify those that should rise to the top. That takes more time and attention. It should provide a consistent approach for comparing vendors for the same product and service. This is a great use of this risk intelligence data. It can identify and justify risk-driven contractual clauses as a new customer. This is another emerging situation that I've been seeing personally, is far more requirements contractually around risk intelligence data. It also gives visibility to the risks of fourth parties, fifth parties, etc. The use of this risk intelligence data can help you identify these parties' risks and make them more discoverable, especially since you don't have a contractual relationship with these vendors and can't actually get documentation from them, most likely. But here is a way for you to be aware of the risks that these fourth parties and nth parties are posing. And you can gather directional guidance and determine actions to take with all of your vendors using this risk intelligence product and data. And let's look at 3 compelling reasons why you might want to consider using intelligence data to monitor your vendors. One is, and we've said this a couple of times already, your third-party risk management team can't do it all. Even in the most well-resourced and mature organizations, they're overwhelmed. There's lots of manual processes and tasks that must be done, and it's just an ineffective way to continuously monitor your vendors. So finding risk intelligence data sources to help you do that is certainly ideal. The other is the cost of a data breach. According to data that we found from 2022, and there's probably more recent data out there, the average cost of a data breach has reached an all-time high of greater than $4 million. So constant proactive monitoring of your vendors that pose the greatest cyber risk to you is absolutely a must, and using risk intelligence data can help with that. And last but not least, again, continuous monitoring is both a regulatory requirement and a best practice. So find ways to get it done with the most effective resource. And again, using risk intelligence data is a great way to make that happen. So let's take a look now at some of the vendor risk domains that would be great ways to utilize intelligence data. First is privacy. You are very concerned about the privacy practices of your vendors, and a low privacy score could be an indicator that possibly those privacy practices are not in good shape. Definitely cybersecurity. Monitoring cybersecurity using intelligence data is a quick and easy way to have a continuous review of cyber threats with your vendors. Business health and credit risk is another one. There are various solutions out there that offer ongoing business health and credit risk data, and this is another one that is worthy to be monitored through risk intelligence. Knowing your vendor, things like OFAC and other sanctions is another great use of vendor risk intelligence, as is negative news. Again, in a world where there's millions of pieces of information that are published on a daily basis, finding a way to navigate through all of those with a system with intelligence data is better than any one manual way to do that. And then lastly, environmental, social, and governance data is another. This is still new data in the marketplace, so there's not a whole lot to be found, but having some intelligence data to mine through what is available is another good use of these vendor risk intelligence sources. For the next several slides, we are going to talk through the specific vendor risks that you should be monitoring, and I will indicate if they are associated with the vendor risk intelligence domains that we just walked through. So first is strategic risk. Strategic risk is that risk that occurs when a prospective or current vendor's decisions and actions aren't compatible with yours. For example, a vendor is reluctant to invest time or money or other resources to ensure that they are providing solid processes, products, and services within your budget and on time, and with sufficient quality. Another risk is operational risk, and that is associated with business health, cybersecurity, privacy, negative news, and know your vendor domains. And this risk occurs when a vendor's product or service is necessary to maintain your daily operations. So you are dependent on this vendor and what they do for you to continue to provide your service. So your organization would definitely be impacted if the vendor's internal processes or people or controls or systems failed. An example here is the vendor fails to resolve issues promptly, doesn't monitor quality or address quality failures, or doesn't sufficiently train employees. Another risk is business continuity risk, and this one happens to be associated with the cybersecurity domains. This risk occurs when an outside event negatively impacts your third-party vendor's ability to conduct business and therefore impacts your organization as a result. This risk can happen when a vendor fails to test business continuity and disaster recovery plans, and they're unprepared for outages or failures. Business continuity risk is especially relevant to critical third-party vendors because those vendors you are dependent on. So it's very important that you monitor the business continuity risk of those critical vendors. So a couple of examples, of course, in this are natural disasters or severe weather events, utility outages, maybe definitely cyber attacks, and pandemics. Of course, we all experience that. But all of these have the ability to negatively impact your performance. Therefore, it is a critical business risk for you to monitor. Next up is compliance and regulatory risk. This one can be associated with the Know Your Vendor and privacy data domains that I mentioned earlier. So this risk arises from a third-party vendor's failure to comply with laws and regulations that govern the products and services that you are offering to your customers, or the vendor's offering to you. So a few examples: the vendor operates in a way that's inconsistent with your organization's policies, procedures, and standards. Additionally, the vendor participates in or encourages maybe deceptive marketing practices, maybe violates laws protecting consumer rights. And then there's information security risk, and this one is associated with the cybersecurity domain. And this risk encompasses both cyber and physical security risk. Information security exists from a third-party vendor's missing or ineffective controls. Cyber attacks and data breaches are two of the most common consequences that can occur from unmitigated or uncorrected cyber risk. Some examples: vendors may pose this risk if they process, transmit, or store your organization's or your customers' data. That's pretty much all of your vendors these days. Your organization also faces risk if the vendor utilizes sensitive information in an unauthorized way. Maybe they don't have third-party audits or certifications that can evaluate and validate that these controls exist. And then we have financial and credit risks associated with the business health and credit risk domain. And this risk directly relates to the financial condition of the third party and its inability to meet contractual obligations and provide products and services that you have bought from them. So some examples: the vendor has decreasing revenue due to maybe canceled orders, loss of a major customer, maybe they have more liabilities than assets, maybe they have a poor credit rating. Other examples might include insufficient investor funding or cash available to them to meet contractual obligations on their end. And then reputation risk, and this, of course, is associated with all domains. And this risk covers a variety of ways in which your third-party vendor could directly or indirectly damage your reputation, your brand, your name. And some examples, we've talked about a few of these already. This could be poor service that they're offering. Maybe they have some negative news from consumers. Maybe they've had some data breaches. They have some lawsuits filed against them. Whatever it may be, but your reputation could also be damaged if this third party represents their relationship with you directly, uses your logo, uses your company name, and has all of this negative news and negative actions against them. Then we have concentration risk, which is associated with the cybersecurity domain. This risk is closely related to business continuity in that both become a bigger focus area for regulators who see the significance of operational resiliency. It usually occurs when one vendor provides too many high-risk or critical services, or when only one vendor in the marketplace provides critical products or services. This is also known as a single point of failure, so think about it that way. Another definition of concentration risk is when a significant portion of your vendor's subcontractors are located in the same geographic area. So again, say that some weather event occurred and the processor behind your more of your significant vendors are all within that region, but they're the fourth parties, and so they're not as prominently known to you. That's the risk of concentration risk. Another less common risk is geopolitical risk, associated with Know Your Vendor, ESG, and negative news domains that we talked about earlier. So this risk can occur when your vendor is located in a country or region that may be vulnerable to political unrest or corruption or human rights violations. The vendor's location could also be at risk of lax privacy or information security laws or other situations that could be harmful. An example here is, a political unrest may develop in a region where your vendor is located, causing them to not be able to sustain operations. So this is another one that is not as well known, but certainly needs to be taken into consideration to know what vendors do live outside of your preferred area of concentration. And lastly, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG risk. And again, that's associated with ESG, Know Your Vendor, and negative news domains. So these risks occur when vendors violate environmental laws, treat people unfairly, or display poor corporate governance or poor corporate behavior. The vendor might fail to identify and adequately prevent human rights violations in its supply chains. This neglect could potentially present your organization with compliance risk. It could also cause supply chain issues, which we have seen over the last few years as well. So that was the last of the specific vendor risks that need to be monitored. And with that, it brings us to our final poll question of the day. Jessie?
Our third and final poll question is, does your organization currently use any vendor risk intelligence products? Yes, no, we are looking into it, whether or not sure. Kelly, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And this question is, what is the primary or ultimate goal of ongoing monitoring?
Ongoing monitoring of vendor risk and performance just helps ensure that the risk level and the quality remain consistent throughout the relationship. Things will happen, things will change with your vendors, some of your vendors, but being prepared to address those changes throughout the life cycle of that vendor is the ultimate goal of ongoing monitoring, keeping you informed. So some of the key questions that you will want to ask during that time is, are they living up to their contractual obligations? Is the benefit of the vendor product and service worth the risks and the cost? And has the cost to risk to benefit ratio changed enough to consider an exit? You definitely want to position yourself to be prepared if things start to go sour, if SLAs aren't being met or there's a severe issue, maybe it's such as a data breach. It's just important to keep a close eye on your vendor, and you do that through ongoing monitoring.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question, as it's interesting to see what everyone says. Before we continue, I would like to mention that we have our Types of Third-Party Vendor Risk ebook available for download in the Related Content widget. As Kelly just walked through examples of this vendor risk domains, this is a handy ebook. Be sure to check it out. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Kelly.
So we're going to finish out this webinar by talking about some recommendations for continuous monitoring. And first is to make sure that you set up your tracking system before ever engaging in contract negotiations with a vendor. And make sure you're including the business owners in designing whatever tracking needs to be put in place for that vendor. The business owners will usually be your first line of defense when it comes to understanding the full impact of your vendor and their performance. And just a couple of contract negotiation tips to remember is, if it's not a part of the contract with the vendor, it's probably not going to happen. So if it's important to you, be sure to get it negotiated in, and you want to place as much responsibility on the vendor as possible. Next, you want to tailor the ongoing monitoring to the type of product or service that is being provided by that vendor and the risks associated with that product and service. And here's just 3 examples of how you might do that. Say it's a call center, so a firm service level agreement on what you expect as far as call answer rates, call recording, listening to recorded calls, regular SLA reporting. Those are the types of expectations you would have on a call center vendor. Maybe it's a statements production company, and some standards around that you would want to be monitoring is around accuracy and tracking performance, and maybe periodic testing to ensure that the delivery dates are met. And then a third one is a core processor. And you certainly want to be monitoring and assessing system availability, maybe change management, verifying that business processes and implementation changes require notification to you. A third one is to implement service level reporting. Of course, this is going to give you visibility into the vendor's performance, and this would be, of course, necessary and really only pertinent or relevant if you have service level requirements in the contract with your vendor. So really taking several steps back, you need to make sure that you have put service level requirements in place in the contracts with those vendors that are most critical to you, that present the highest risk to you, and again are critical in your performance to ensure that you are then receiving the performance on that on the SLA that you put in place with that vendor, and that you are monitoring it. So again, regardless of what type of vendor this is, there's a couple of examples on here, but it doesn't matter what it is. It's having that SLA contracted and then monitoring its performance. Another recommendation is to monitor vendor complaints. There are many ways you can do this, but we certainly recommend having someone or some service monitor the following items. One is a vendor's social media pages, and as we all know, there can be many of these. Also, the CFPB complaint database, and if there's anyone on the call that's not familiar with that, that's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This is where all of the fines are assessed when there are known and confirmed wrongdoings against consumers. And then there are customer complaint sites out there like Ripoff Report, and there's probably others. And then, of course, Google News Alerts. Regardless of what system you're using or who might be doing this, it is important to know what your vendors' customers are saying about them, especially if you have vendors that are customer-facing, because they're representing you to the customers, because negative comments about your vendors may certainly impact your reputation and be seen as negative comments about you. And the last 2 recommendations to offer is automate as much as possible. And again, we all get so busy, and monitoring a vendor's performance is time-consuming and takes resources, but it isn't something we should put off. We should find ways to make sure that happens, and so finding ways to automate that is a big step in the right direction. And then don't forget the follow-up. Again, if you discover a risky finding, discover an issue, discover something that was promised that hasn't been received, then you want to make sure that you are documenting that and that you are following up on that to ensure the vendor's compliance. That brings us to the end of the webinar, and of course I want to wrap it all up with 3 top key takeaways. First is to prioritize continuous monitoring. I started off here, and I can't say this enough, that it definitely needs to be prioritized. It needs to have processes and procedures wrapped around it with responsible parties assigned to them. The second key takeaway is to understand the benefits of an effective and compliant continuous monitoring program. Most important point here is that it definitely keeps you safe from the negative impacts of your vendors. And lastly, use all of the resources that you have available to you, using data intelligence. Possibly you might be using outsourced solutions. Whatever resources you have, be sure to use them all, because it is a time-consuming process. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jessie, and just want to say one last thank you to everyone for joining this webinar today.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Kelly for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On March 5th, our 4th and nth parties, What You Need to Know to Effectively Manage Your Extended Third-Party Ecosystem webinar. And on March 19th, our How to Review Your Vendor's Financial Health, a Walkthrough of Financial Documents webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Kelly, our next question is, should the contract be reviewed as part of ongoing monitoring?
Yes, and I think I mentioned that on one of my slides, but yes, the contract should be a part of the ongoing monitoring review. In that regard, you should be meeting with your vendor throughout the year with the ongoing monitoring. You should be checking in on their performance. You should be reviewing the SLAs and any reports that they're providing you. You may have established quarterly meetings with them or twice annually meetings with them, whatever business reviews, but during all of those interactions with your vendor, you're going to be monitoring all kinds of things, of course. And it's always, especially if there are SLAs involved with that vendor, you should be reviewing the SLAs against the contract on an annual basis. And I will tell you from my personal experience here at VendMinder, I'm seeing more and more customers want to review the contract language annually, or definitely at renewal, and not just accept the language that was agreed upon originally, because so much changes from year to year. So many regulations change, new risks are posed, AI enters the playing field, all kinds of things change. So absolutely the contract should be part of the ongoing monitoring.
Great. Our next question. Should ongoing monitoring be the responsibility of one person? And what is the best practice around implementing this part of the life cycle?
Yeah, well, first of all, all of your vendors are going to live in this stage. Really, all of the vendors that are active in your system should be in this stage. So depending on the size of the organization, it's probably highly unlikely that any one person could be the sole responsible party to ensure that it's all done. Plus, if you're doing ongoing monitoring correctly, you are reviewing various data that's provided by that vendor, audit reports, findings from pen tests, all the various privacy policies, et cetera, et cetera. And so and financial reports, and so having one person skilled in all of those areas to have that sole responsibility is, again, likely a challenge. So it's really, I think you should consider it a team sport. It takes multiple players to make it successful within any organization, because you're going to have specific needs from different players on that team, if you will, that have a skill set to look at certain parts of the vendor's data and documentation as part of that review. So I think it's just unlikely that one person would be. Now, you may very well have one person who is responsible to ensure that it all happens, and then they have to pull all these team members together to do their part and check up on them and make sure they're doing their part. So that's likely, but to actually be responsible for doing it all is probably a hard thing to expect of one person.
Great. Our next question here. What regulations should I review to ensure I am meeting expectations with my third-party risk management program?
Well, there's so many, and every industry would have some unique regulations specific to them. But we have always kind of gathered around those regulations that are specific to the financial services industry because they were originally the most regulated industry out there. I don't know that you can say that today, but they were. And the bulk of third-party risk management originated around that. So they're like the gold star, if you will, to go follow. So, if you want to start somewhere, start there. Start looking at the regulators of the financial services industry. That's the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or the OCC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve Board. And then, of course, last year, they all joined forces and created the interagency guidelines. I think it was last year. I believe it was 23. Of course, healthcare will have specific things around HIPAA, and then there will be the Federal Trade Commission for other organizations. So again, there's a list of them that you, depending on your organization, depending on your industry, you should go review. But if you start with those four that regulate the financial services industry, that will get the bulk of everything that exists in all the other ones as well.
Great. Our next question is, do you need to perform a whole new third-party risk management risk assessment if an existing vendor is acquired by another entity, even if they say there will be no changes to management or operations?
That's a good question. I mean, my initial reaction is it would be prudent to do a new risk assessment, because it's, depending how quickly the new ownership can incorporate that company service inside of their own systems, inside of their own firewalls and everything else. So all of that could change pretty quickly, depending on how quickly that can be done. So I think the best practice around that would be, yes, I think you should, even though they say nothing changed with management or operations. Just better to ask those questions directly instead of just assuming that nothing changed.
Great. I think we have time for one very quick question. Where does reviewing SOC reports come into play when we think about continuous monitoring, and how formal should that review be?
Yeah, so SOC reports are absolutely a critical document that you will want to review for vendors who have access to your data for certain. The SOC reports are outlining the various controls and auditing against those controls to ensure, the principles of your relationship with that vendor. So it should be pretty, formal. Okay, so how formal? Definitely someone who has some experience should read the SOC report and review the findings and exceptions found in the SOC report, any recommendations made from the SOC report, ask questions of the vendor if there's exceptions or findings that are concerning. If no one in your organization has a skill set to review that, then there's, lots of places, Minder being one, where those kinds of things can be done and outsourced. But so I would call that a formal review. Yes, whether you have an internal resource to do that or an outsourced resource, and a formal review of the SOC report and other third-party audits, depending on the vendor and the data that that vendor has access to, is certainly a critical part of ongoing monitoring.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Kelly, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Kelly for her time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to continuous monitoring. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.